Welcome back to the Bring Our Troops Home podcast and the Truth About Dick Cheney series. Before we go any further into the story, I need to stop for just a moment because this weekend, members of the Iowa National Guard were killed in Syria. American citizen soldiers deployed thousands of miles from home, lost their lives in an undeclared, open-ended conflict that most Americans couldn't even tell you was still happening. Families are grieving right now. Units are hurting. And yet Washington barely pauses. This is not history. It's not theory. And it's not about an academic debate about foreign policy. This is happening right now. National Guardsmen are not tripwires left behind to drag the country into another undeclared and open-ended war. They are citizens first, soldiers second, and their lives are not leveraged for a failed foreign policy. And yet that's exactly how they're being used. The Constitution is clear about who decides when the country goes to war. Congress is supposed to debate it. Congress is supposed to vote. Congress is supposed to own it. But instead, for more than 2 decades, they have hidden behind vague authorizations, permanent emergencies, and silence. The result is exactly what we saw this weekend. Guard members sent into harm's way without the consent of the American people, without a declaration of war from Congress, and without any accountability to anybody. No debate, no vote, no ownership, just another deployment under an authorization passed before some of these soldiers were even born. That is the constitutional failure that we are living with today. That is the system that Dick Cheney helped build, and that is why these deaths are not accidents. They're consequences. There's a line in scripture that has been echoing in my head since this news broke. Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture. Jeremiah 23:1. National Guard troops ripped from their homes and their communities and sent to fight and possibly die in undeclared wars is exactly that. Destroying and scattering the sheep of his pasture. It is elected leaders, I use that term very loosely, who are scattering the flock. It's men in power avoiding responsibility while young Americans pay the price. And it's why Defend the Guard matters right now, not as an idea, but finally as a line in the sand. And if you believe that citizen soldiers should not be sent into combat without Congress doing its constitutional duty, I need you to go to defendtheguard.us. And I need you to sign the petition. This is how we force the issue back where it belongs. This is how we stop using the Guard as a political cover for wars that nobody will vote for. Because the story that we're about to continue telling, it's not just about Iraq. It's about how America was sold a war that it didn't want, built on fake intelligence, sold by trusted voices, and rubber stamped by a Congress that refuses to do its job. And the consequences of that failure are still being paid for today by National Guard families in places like Iowa. Now, let's talk about how that sell actually happened. All right, if you've been with me through the series so far, welcome back. And if you're just now joining us, I want you to understand where we are before we take another step forward. Because in the last episode, we walked through how the war in Iraq was engineered behind closed doors, not debated, not demanded by evidence, engineered, built. You saw how Dick Cheney and his hand-picked network built a parallel presidency, how legal guardrails were ripped out and how intelligence was bent, laundered, and fabricated until it produced the conclusion that they wanted. And by the end of the previous episode, the machinery was complete. The lie was built, but a machine, no matter how sophisticated, still needs power to move. And fabricated intelligence, no matter how carefully assembled, still doesn't sell itself to a skeptical public or a divided world. It has to come carried by someone that people trust, someone whose credibility is so deep, so earned, that when he speaks, the debate stops. And that's where we left off. The most respected man in America was about to become the delivery mechanism for the most sophisticated disinformation campaign in modern history. And that man was Colin Powell. And before we go any further, I want to be clear about what this episode is and what it isn't. This is not a cheap takedown of Colin Powell. This is an armchair quarterbacking from people who never carried responsibility. Powell was not a cartoon villain. He wasn't a neocon ideologue. He wasn't looking for a war to manage. He was a soldier. He was a public servant. He was a man whose instincts were shaped by the cost of Vietnam and Desert Storm and the discipline of command, which is exactly why Colin Powell matters in this story. Because when Dick Cheney needed the war to move from theory to inevitability, he didn't need another briefing. He didn't need another memo. He didn't need another anonymous leak. He needed trust and he needed confidence. And Colin Powell had both. So this episode is about how that trust was used, how it was boxed in, managed, and ultimately spent. It's about how a man whose credibility was built over a lifetime was put into a position where his voice did the work that fake intelligence couldn't do on its own. And it's about what happened next. Because once Powell spoke, Congress folded. And once Congress folded, the Constitution broke. And once that break became normal, the consequences didn't stay in 2003. They carried forward year after year, deployment after deployment, all the way to the Guard families that we opened this episode with from Iowa. This is the story of how that sale was completed. And it starts with the man that they needed the most. Colin Powell wasn't the kind of man that Dick Cheney could replace. If Cheney needed a memo, he had David Addington. If he needed talking points, he had Scooter Libby. If he needed a case built out of rumor and scraps and garbage, he had Douglas Faith in the Office of Special Plans. But if he needed trust, there was only one name that carried the kind of weight that could move the world. And it was Colin Powell. Powell was not a neocon. He wasn't one of the true believers who had been itching for Iraq since the 1990s. He was the guy a lot of Americans thought of as the adult in the Bush administration room. He was a soldier, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man who looked like he would tell you the truth even when you didn't want to hear it. And that reputation was the entire point, because by late 2002 and early 2003, the case for Iraq had a problem. It couldn't overcome with volume, with theatrics, or with leaks. It wasn't sturdy. The scaffolding wasn't holding up. It didn't hold up under any scrutiny at all. And Powell could feel it. First came Powell's doubt phase. Powell's doubts weren't abstract. They were specific, they were practical, and they were immediate. Where is the intelligence coming from? How do we know? What's the sourcing? What's real and what's conjecture? There's reporting from that period that Powell's team went through an early draft of his UN remarks and started stripping out claims because the sourcing was so weak. One account describes Powell becoming furious at the lack of adequate sourcing and refusing to read any parts of it in his speech, saying, "I am not reading this bullshit." That is not the language of a man who is eager to sell a war. That's a man who knows he's being handed a product, not an intelligence report. And it fits with what Powell would later say about the process. He didn't treat the speech as a normal rollout. He treated it like a dangerous instrument that could only be used if he personally scrubbed every detail in it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Powell's stature didn't come from being right about everything. It came from the fact that Americans believed he wasn't reckless. So when Cheney's circle needed the case to stop sounding like inside baseball paranoia and start sounding like certainty, Powell's credibility was the bridge. That credibility was priceless because it did two things at once. It made skeptical people think if Powell is saying it, it must be real. And it gave political cover to everybody else to fall in line. The UN wasn't an audience. Congress was watching. Allies were watching. Media executives were watching. Editors were watching. And millions of Americans who didn't trust Dick Cheney with a vending machine were willing to listen to Colin Powell. And that's why the war didn't just need evidence. It needed him. Powell didn't flip overnight. He moved the way serious, duty-bound men often move when they're trapped inside a machine that's already rolling. He started skeptical. Then he became open-minded, not because he loved the case, but because he believed the institutions around him were capable of doing honest work. This is where Cheney's system shows itself. Powell wasn't being invited into a free and open debate over whether Iraq should be invaded. He was being pulled into the process where the outcome was already decided, and his job was to make it presentable. Years later, Powell would describe the speech and its aftermath as a great intelligence failure. Kind of an understatement. He also said that the decision for military action had already been made when he gave the speech. Think about that for a minute. Powell wasn't standing at the UN to help the world decide whether war was necessary. He was standing at the UN to help the world accept a war that had already been chosen. That's how skepticism turns into open-mindedness inside of a locked system. You start by telling yourself, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe the CIA has more than they can show publicly. Maybe the president is seeing a fuller picture. Maybe the consequences of dissent inside the cabinet are worse than the risk of trusting the system. And once you start thinking like that, you're already halfway down that slippery slope. And next came Powell's scrubbing phase, where he desperately tried to make it true enough. Powell didn't want to be a mouthpiece. He wanted to be sure. And there's telling details about the final hours before the UN appearance. Powell wanted CIA Director George Tenet physically sitting right behind him on camera as he made the case. That wasn't stagecraft. That was Powell trying to anchor responsibility back to the intelligence apparatus. It's the behavior of a man who senses danger. And it matches what Powell later said publicly about the speech being painful and permanently attached to his record. He said, "It's a blot. I'm the one who presented it to the world." And that line contains the whole tragedy. Powell understood even then that once he delivered it, it no longer belonged to Dick Cheney. It belonged to him. He tried to mitigate it. He tried to scrub it. He tried to cut out pieces. He tried to keep it from being a complete fraud. But the problem with scrubbing a bad case is that you can remove some of the rot, but you're still left with structure that collapses under any scrutiny. And by the time Powell walked into the UN, something had changed. He might not have believed every claim in his bones, but he believed enough to speak with certainty. And that's what mattered. Powell's voice was the seal. When he said, "We know," millions of people heard, "We know." When he said, "Eyewitness accounts," millions of people heard, "Confirmed." And when he said, "Mobile biological production facilities," millions of people heard, "Proof." And this is how the transition completed itself. Not because Powell became a fanatic, but because Powell became a vessel. He accepted the mission on its framework. He accepted the responsibility of presenting the case. He accepted the posture of certainty that moment required. And that is the moment that he stops being the internal skeptic and becomes the public instrument. And finally, the mouthpiece phase, where Powell's credibility was a weapon, because once Powell speaks, the war effort changes texture. Debate narrows, skeptics get shoved to the edge. Media coverage shifts from "is this true" to "what happens next?" And everybody who wanted to vote yes without owning the war suddenly had cover that they needed. Powell's chief of staff, Lawrence Wilkerson, later said that he wished he had not been involved in the UN presentation at all and called it, for him, the lowest point of his career. That regret matters because it confirms what the machine did. It took the credibility of a respected soldier statesman and it used it to carry claims that could not have carried themselves. Powell's morals weren't erased. They were leveraged. His doubts weren't disproven. They were managed, and his reputation wasn't incidental. It was the payload. It was the entire operation. And once that credibility was spent, the case no longer needed debate. It only needed a stage. The performance, the props, the certainty that wasn't real. The United Nations is where wars become respectable. Not because the UN authorizes them, not because it enforces them, but because it gives power a global audience and the language of legitimacy. This is the room where the world leaders don't just speak to each other, they speak past each other, through each other, to their own people back home. This is where governments take ideas that would sound reckless on a domestic stage and dress it up as international necessity. We've all seen it before. Presidents and prime ministers standing at that podium to warn of a looming threat, to declare moral urgency, and to tell the world that time has run out and action is the only responsible choice. Some of the most consequential speeches of the last century have been delivered in that room. Speeches that reshaped borders, justified sanctions, hardened alliances, and prepared populations for war. Because once something is said there, it doesn't feel partisan anymore. It feels official. And I think that was the trick. The UN chamber turns national claims into global narratives. It takes contested ideas through repetition and authority and converts them into something that sounds like a settled fact. Once the cameras are on, ambiguity is a liability. Certainty is the currency on the international stage. And that's why it mattered so much. The Iraq War didn't need congressional applause yet. It didn't need NATO signatures. It didn't even need public enthusiasm. It needed credibility. And this is the place where credibility could be manufactured at scale. And on February 5th, 2003, Colin Powell walked into that chamber carrying more than just a briefcase. He carried the accumulated trust of a lifetime, a reputation built across decades of service, war, restraint, and discipline. He doesn't look like a salesman when he walks in that room. He looks like a man who wouldn't lie to you, which is exactly why he's there. And this is where Colin Powell stepped up.
My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
Ladies and gentlemen, that sentence right there does more work than the rest of his UN speech combined. Powell doesn't say we believe. He doesn't say we assess. He says facts, solid intelligence. This is not an accident. That credibility being deployed deliberately. Powell understood the weight of his voice, and the administration understood it even better. This was the moment where doubt was supposed to die. And for most of the world, it did.
We know that Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more.
Listen to that verb. We know. Not we suspect, not we fear, not we're concerned. We know. But the intelligence community didn't know it at all. At best, they suspected. At worst, they were guessing. Internal assessments were filled with caveats, dissenting views, and unresolved questions. None of that survives the translation to the podium at the United Nations. Powell's certainty replaced evidence, and that substitution mattered. Check this next one.
Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. This is just about the amount of a teaspoon. Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate in the fall of 2001. This forced several hundred people to undergo emergency medical treatment and killed 2 postal workers just from an amount just about this quantity that was inside of an envelope.
Folks, this is theater. The vial isn't proof of anything. It's symbolism. It's imagery. It's fear compressed into a visual. Powell knew exactly what he was doing here because he knew what images do that arguments can't. But here's the part that people forget. Powell didn't want this speech to be sloppy. He reportedly went through the draft line by line. He cut claims he thought were too weak. He challenged sourcing. And at one point, according to multiple accounts, Powell exploded after reviewing the draft and said, I am not reading this bullshit. That tells you something else important. Powell knew the parts of his speech and his case that were garbage. He also knew the ones that weren't. So knowing that something is weak is not the same as refusing to deliver it.
This is evidence, not conjecture. This is true. This is all well documented. We have amassed much intelligence indicating that Iraq is continuing to make these weapons. One of the most worrisome things that emerges from the thick intelligence file we have on Iraq's biological weapons is the existence of mobile production facilities used to make biological agents. Let me take you inside that intelligence file and share with you what we know from eyewitness accounts. We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails.
This claim becomes one of the most infamous lies of the entire war. Mobile biological weapon labs that actually did not exist. The source for this claim was deeply unreliable. Intelligence analysts questioned it. Some rejected outright. Powell later acknowledged that this was wrong. But in the moment, it sounds definitive. So why did he include it? Because by this point, the speech isn't about truth. It's about completeness. It's about overwhelming the audience with enough claims that questioning any single one of them feels a little nitpicky, even maybe a little bit irresponsible. This is a sales technique that we've all seen and used before.
We are not surprised that Iraq is harboring Zarqawi and his subordinates. This understanding builds on decades-long experience with respect to ties between Iraq and al-Qaeda. Going back to the early and mid-1990s, when bin Laden was based in Sudan, an al-Qaeda source tells us that Saddam and bin Laden reached an understanding that al-Qaeda would no longer support activities against Baghdad. Early al-Qaeda ties were forged by secret high-level intelligence service contacts with al-Qaeda, secret Iraqi intelligence high-level contacts with al-Qaeda. We know members of both organizations met repeatedly and have met at least 8 times at very senior levels.
This one is one of the most consequential lines in the entire speech. Powell doesn't say that Saddam Hussein planned 9/11. He doesn't need to. He lets the audience connect the dots themselves, and that is more powerful than making the claim outright. The intelligence community never established an operational relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. I'm going to say that again. It can't be repeated enough. The intelligence community never established an operational relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. That connection, it didn't exist in the ways that the line even suggested. But emotionally, it lands. Afghanistan and Iraq blur together. 9/11 bleeds into Baghdad. And suddenly, opposing the Iraq war feels like forgetting who attacked us on 9/11. This is how wars get sold.
The photos that I am about to show you are sometimes hard for the average person to interpret, hard for me. But as I show you these images, I will try to capture and explain what they mean, what they indicate to our imagery specialists. Let's look at one. This one is about a weapons munition facility, a facility that holds ammunition at a place called Taji. This is one of about 65 such facilities in Iraq. We know that this one has housed chemical munitions. Here you see 15 munitions bunkers in yellow and red outlines. The 4 that are in red squares represent active chemical munitions bunkers. How do I know that? How can I say that? Let me give you a closer look. Look at the image on the left. On the left is a close-up of one of the 4 chemical bunkers. The 2 arrows indicate the presence of sure signs that the bunkers are storing chemical munitions.
Colin Powell walks the world through satellite photos, imagery, arrows, labels, interpretations. But what the audience doesn't see are the dissenting analysts who warn that satellite imagery is easy to misread, that dual-use facilities exist, that conclusions drawn from overhead photos are often speculative at best. But Powell's delivery removed any uncertainty. That's just the through line. Every ambiguity is resolved before it reaches the microphone.
Iraq has put itself in deeper material breach and closer to the day when it will face serious consequences for its continued defiance of this council. My colleagues, we have an obligation to our citizens. We have an obligation to this body to see that our resolutions are complied with. I believe that Iraq is now in further material breach of its obligations. I believe this conclusion is irrefutable and undeniable. Iraq has now placed itself in danger of the serious consequences called for in UN Resolution 1441. And this body places itself in danger of irrelevance if it allows Iraq to continue to defy its will without responding effectively and immediately.
Now, the frame flips. This is no longer about whether the case is true. It's about whether inaction is acceptable. The burden shifts from the accuser to the audience. If you don't act, you are irresponsible. If you hesitate, you are enabling danger. Powell closes the door on debate right behind him. Coincidentally enough, sitting right behind him, where the cameras can see him, is CIA Director George Tenet. That wasn't stagecraft. That was Powell trying to share the weight, trying to tell himself and the world that this wasn't just his call. But history doesn't remember George Tenet sitting there. In fact, I'll bet you nobody watching this episode remembers it. But everybody remembers Colin Powell in his speech. Powell later called his speech a blot on his record. Lawrence Wilkerson, his chief of staff, would go further, and he would call it his lowest point of his career. He would say that the speech was built on intelligence that should never have made it to the world stage. Both things can be true. Powell tried to minimize the damage. Powell cut what he could. Powell questioned what he saw, but Powell still delivered the speech. And once he did, the sale was complete. The speech didn't authorize the war. It didn't declare it. It didn't even prove the case. It did something far, far more important. It made war feel responsible. And once that happened, Congress didn't have to wrestle with the truth. They just had to rubber stamp the damn story. Colin Powell's speech didn't spark debate. It ended it. And within hours of Colin Powell stepping away from the UN podium, the language hardens everywhere that matters. No, not because new evidence appears, not because inspectors confirmed anything, but because authority has spoken and authority has decided. Cable news stops asking whether the claims are true and starts asking how long the world will tolerate defiance. Editorial boards talk about credibility and resolve, and panels shift from skepticism to logistics. The speech becomes shorthand. Many of the new articles and talking points started like this: after Powell's presentation, ... given the evidence laid out at the United Nations by Colin Powell, ... in light of what Secretary Powell showed the world at the UN, ... That framing does the work. Powell's credibility is now substitute for proof. And inside Washington, the effect is even clearer. Members of Congress who had been privately uneasy suddenly find cover. They don't need to defend intelligence assessments anymore. They don't need to explain preemption. They can point to the United Nations and say the case has already been made. Powell didn't just sell the war to the world. He sold it for Congress. And Congress was eager to buy it. And this is where the post 9/11 moral framework snaps fully into place, because long before Iraq entered the picture, George W. Bush had already drawn the lines of acceptable dissent.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Now, admittedly, that line wasn't about Iraq, but Iraq lived inside of it. And after 9/11, the executive branch defined national security as a moral test. If the president said a threat existed, opposing his response wasn't framed as disagreement. It was framed as recklessness, as disloyalty, as endangering America. That framework didn't disappear as the years passed. It migrated. And by the time Iraq is being sold, the words don't need to be repeated. The logic is already baked in. If you question the intelligence, you're not being careful. You're being dangerous. If you ask for proof, you're not being responsible. You're being naive. And once Powell speaks, that moral trap snaps shut. Then comes the intellectual trap, because the groundwork for this moment had been laid a full year earlier. You've got to watch this gem from Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld when asked if there is a verified link between Saddam Hussein and providing weapons of mass destruction to terrorists.
In regard to Iraq, weapons of mass destruction and terrorists, is there any evidence to indicate that Iraq has attempted to or is willing to supply terrorists with weapons of mass destruction? Because there are reports that there is no evidence of a direct link between Baghdad and some of these terrorist organizations.
Reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history of our country and other free countries, it is the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones. And
excuse me, but is this an unknown unknown?
I'm not.
Several unknowns, and I'm just wondering.
I'm not going to say which it is.
Mr. Secretary.
When pressed further, he doubled down on the ambiguity and the pompous, arrogant garbage spewing out of his mouth.
But in order to believe things, we often like to have evidence.
I could have said that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, or vice versa.
That sentence should have ended the conversation, but instead, it became doctrine. Because once you accept that type of fuzzy garbage logic, the case for war becomes unfalsifiable. If inspectors find nothing, that doesn't disprove the claim, it just proves concealment. If intelligence is thin, that doesn't weaken the argument, it proves that the enemy is clever. Failure becomes the confirmation. There is no longer any outcome at all that would stop escalation. And this is how you sell a war that can't be proven. You don't argue evidence, you eliminate the need for it. And when you combine that logic with the post 9/11 moral framing, dissent becomes impossible. If you oppose the war, you're against security. If you question the intelligence, you're aiding the enemy. If you hesitate, You're inviting catastrophe. Oh my God, how many times have we heard this over the last 25 years? And that's the environment that Powell's UN speech lands in. The speech doesn't introduce certainty, it legitimizes it. And the administration then goes out and floods the zone. Cheney goes back on Sunday shows speaking in absolutes now. Rice is talking about mushroom clouds. Rumsfeld dismisses inspections as political theater. Powell, he reinforces his presentation in follow-up appearances, no longer hedging his bets or his comments or his words, no longer caveating it with any uncertainty. Different faces, same message. The facts are settled. The debate's over. The decision has been made. But you notice what never happens. There is no pause to let the inspectors finish. There's no serious engagement with dissenting analysts. There's no reopening the underlying assumptions that the entire argument was built on, because the speech was never meant to open a process. It was meant to close it. The troops, they're already staged in the Middle East, and contracts, they're already signed with all of Dick Cheney's buddies. Timelines are already locked in. The UN was not a forum for decision. It was the final piece of cover. And once that cover exists, responsibility for the war starts to evaporate, which is exactly when Congress steps forward, not to stop the war, but to avoid having to own it. By the time Colin Powell stood at the United Nations in February of 2003, Congress had already made its most important decision, not to declare war, but to avoid doing so. The vote that mattered had already happened months earlier. In October of 2002, Congress passed the authorization of use of military force against Iraq. The invasion hadn't begun. UN inspectors were still on the ground. Powell hadn't even delivered his speech to the UN yet. Yet, Congress had handed the president a blank check and the authority to go to war anyway. And that timing matters because it proves that Powell's speech was never about persuading Congress. Congress had already surrendered its responsibility. The speech was about persuading the world and retroactively justifying a decision that had already been locked in. The Iraq AUMF did not drift through Congress by accident. It was carried there by very important people. In the House, it was introduced by the Speaker of the House, Denny Hassard, and it was treated as leadership business rather than the gravest decision that a republic can make. Debate was compressed. Dissent was managed. Speed mattered more than scrutiny. And in the Senate, the companion resolution was carried by Joe Lieberman. And Lieberman's role, it mattered far beyond procedure. Lieberman had once been considered an anti-war Democrat. He built his reputation as a centrist, a consensus builder, the most bipartisan member of the Senate. When Lieberman stepped forward to carry the Iraq resolution, it sent a signal that Washington understood immediately. This wasn't reckless. This wasn't partisan. This was responsible consensus. And that bipartisan seal was priceless. It allowed Republicans to claim restraint and Democrats to claim seriousness. It allowed members to tell their constituents that people who knew better had already weighed the evidence. It allowed Congress to step back from the judgment while pretending to exercise it. And it happened for three reasons that are as old as politics itself: fear, cowardice, and careerism. Fear, because opposing the authorization in a post 9/11 political climate invited accusations of weakness or disloyalty. Fear of attack ads, fear of headlines, fear of being isolated while the momentum rushed forward. Cowardice, because declaring war requires ownership. It requires saying out loud and on the record that American lives will be spent and that you accept responsibility for what follows. And AUMF lets you avoid that. It lets you vote yes without ever saying why. And careerism, because the safest vote in Washington is the one that aligns with power. The administration wanted this authorization, party leadership wanted unity, and the media wanted inevitability. Very few members were willing to risk their careers and slow the machine. Powell's credibility made all three easier. And once the most trusted man in America spoke with certainty, members could tell themselves they weren't dodging responsibility. They were deferring to the experts. They were trusting the system. They were being prudent, but they weren't. They were giving away authority that they didn't own. The document they passed makes that unmistakable. There's no declaration of war. There's no clearly defined enemy. There's no geographic limits. There's no expiration. The AUMF authorized the president to use force as he determines to be necessary and appropriate. Congress did not decide whether war was necessary. Congress delegated that decision to the president. That is not constitutional caution. That is surrender. But not everybody went along. Congressman Ron Paul understood exactly what was happening. He saw the AUMF as a way to avoid responsibility while pretending to act. He argued that if Congress believed war with Iraq was justified, then Congress had a duty to declare it. Not authorize it for the president, but to declare it. So Congressman Paul introduced a resolution calling for a declaration of war, not because he supported the invasion, but because he wanted Congress to confront the gravity of what it was about to do. He wanted members to vote honestly, visibly, and constitutionally. The declaration, though, it never reached the floor. It was blocked in committee. And the reason it was blocked tells you everything that you need to know. Henry Hyde, who was the chairman of the House International Relations Committee, dismissed Paul's effort as inappropriate and anachronistic, saying flatly that declaring war isn't done anymore. Think about that. The Constitution hadn't changed. The stakes hadn't changed. Only Congress had. Declaring war required responsibility. Authorizing force allowed members to vote yes and walk away. Hyde wasn't rejecting Paul's argument. He was admitting the institution no longer wanted to do its job. They wanted war. They just didn't want ownership. Others opposed the authorization outright. Barbara Lee from California, she already known for her lone stand against the 2001 AUMF, warned that another open-ended authorization would lead to more endless war. She was dismissed as unrealistic. Bernie Sanders, then a House member from Vermont, voted no as well. He warned that authorizing force without clear limits would drag the country into a war based on speculation rather than necessity. Sounds like you got it right. But they were in the minority, overwhelmingly so. The House passed the AUMF 296 to 133. The Senate passed it 77 to 23. Republicans and Democrats, both of them, they voted yes. And among them was a congressman from North Carolina named Walter Jones. He voted yes. He voted for the authorization, believing what many were told. And then as the war unfolded and he came to understand what that vote had done, he later called it the greatest regret of his life. What set Jones apart was what he did next. He didn't excuse his vote. He didn't hide behind party loyalty. He tried to atone. Jones wrote to and visited the families of every single fallen service member until Congressman Jones passed away. He kept track of the names of the dead. He placed a sign outside of his office that read, "How many more?" He became one of the most consistent critics of the war inside Congress and paid a political price for it. Jones understood something that Congress as an institution refused to face, that this vote had real human consequences. And here is the constitutional truth at the center of all of it. Congress does not possess war powers to give away. Those powers belong to you, to me, to the people. Congress holds them in trust. And it has no authority whatsoever to transfer that responsibility to the executive branch and call it prudence. But by passing the Iraq AUMF, that's exactly what it did. It took the parallel presidency Dick Cheney had built behind closed doors and it supercharged it. It put it on steroids. It normalized executive war making and it turned abdication into habit. Powell provided credibility. Cheney provided momentum. Congress provided permission. And once Congress stepped aside, the Constitution went with it. Once Congress handed the authority away, it still had one very important job left to do for self-preservation. It needed to make the decision sound noble. Members, they didn't go home and tell their constituents they had avoided a declaration of war. They didn't explain the difference between an authorization of use of military force and a war declaration. They didn't walk voters through the constitutional implications of what they had just done. Nope. They went on television. They went on the Sunday shows. They went on cable news. They went on the radio. And they repeated the same talking points over and over until the language hardened into common sense. This wasn't a debate, it was a rollout. And members who had voted yes didn't defend the intelligence. They didn't explain the scope of the authorization. They didn't justify the lack of limits. They pointed to the authority and invoked emotion. And the most common phrase, the most insulting phrase, and the most dishonest was, "We have to support the troops." That line did not explain the vote, it replaced it. Questioning the war was reframed as questioning the men and women who would be asked to fight it. Asking why Congress hadn't declared war was treated as a distraction, even an insult. The decision itself was treated as settled, inevitable, and beyond the reach of us ordinary smelly citizens. This is how abdication gets laundered into virtue. Members of Congress appeared on television nodding gravely, speaking in tones of reluctant resolve. They said the president had the tools that he now needed. They said the intelligence agencies had done their work. They said the world was watching and waiting for an American response. And if anybody pushed back, the frame snapped right back into place. You are undermining morale. You are giving comfort to the enemy. You are playing politics with national security. Notice how carefully the language was chosen. Nobody is saying that the war is constitutional. No one is saying that it's limited. No one is saying that Congress owns the decision. They're saying it's necessary. And once necessity is accepted, everything else becomes noise. Cable news helped to complete the process. Coverage focused on vote counts and countdown clocks, on troop movement and embedded reporters, on maps and timelines. The questions of whether the war should happen fades behind the question of when it will actually start. The American people are not asked to consent. They're asked to pop a bowl of popcorn and watch. And this is where the phrase support the troops becomes a shield. It's used to shut down discussion rather than honor service. It turns citizens into spectators and soldiers into symbols. The effect is chilling because once the war is framed as inevitable, opposing it feels pointless. And once opposing it feels pointless, silence looks like maturity. And once silence becomes the norm, accountability disappears. This is how Congress avoids consequences. They vote yes, and then outsource the moral weight to the executive branch. They let the media handle the optics. They let patriotism absorb the blowback, and they move on. The war is no longer a decision, it's an event. And by the time the bombs fall, we're selling it as complete. The country has been conditioned to accept the outcome without ever being asked the question that mattered the most. Should we even go to war? What happened in the run-up to Iraq was not a mistake. It was a transformation. The war did not merely violate norms and stretch precedent. It completed a transfer of power that Dick Cheney had spent his entire career preparing for. Iraq was not the objective. Iraq was just the mechanism. Article 1 of the Constitution is explicit. The power to declare war belongs to Congress because the founders understood something enduring. Executives, presidents, are drawn to conflict. And republics fail when one branch controls both the sword and the justification for using it. That safeguard did not fail accidentally in 2002. It was dismantled deliberately. Cheney did not improvise after 9/11. He returned to a theory that he'd been refining since Vietnam and Watergate, one built around the idea that the presidency had been weakened and needed to reclaim its authority from a Congress that supposedly had stolen from it. That theory did not stay abstract. It was operationalized by David Addington. Addington, Cheney's legal enforcer, was not a background lawyer. He was the engine, and for years he had argued that Congress should not meaningfully constrain the president in matters of national security. War powers, in his view, were executive by nature. Congressional involvement existed to legitimize decisions, not to restrain them. The Iraq AUMF reads like that worldview made statutory. Congress did not draft an independent war authorization and invite the White House to respond. It adopted a framework that reflected Addington's legal architecture almost point for point. Broad discretion, no limits, no endpoints, maximum deference to presidential judgment. The Iraq AUMF was the instrument that made Cheney's theory operational. And by steering Congress towards an authorization instead of a declaration, Cheney and Addington achieved something far more consequential than approval for a single war. They created a system in which Congress appeared involved while surrendering its core responsibility. And that distinction actually matters because a declaration of war is an act of ownership. It requires clarity, limits, and accountability. An authorization is an act of permission. It allows Congress to step back, defer judgment to somebody else, and claim that it never fully committed. Cheney understood this difference instinctively. Addington designed it legally. So instead of forcing a declaration, Congress was presented with a document that transferred judgment to the executive branch under the guise of responsibility. Here's what Congress actually authorized. Congress authorized the president to use U.S. military force whenever he alone determined it was necessary and appropriate to address the so-called continuing threat from Iraq. Congress authorized the president to wage war, enforce all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq, including vague and decades-old resolutions open to broad interpretation. Congress authorized the president to decide for himself when diplomacy had failed, requiring only notification of congressional leadership rather than actual approval. Congress authorized the president to tie the Iraq war to the broader war on terror, despite no declared connection to the attacks on September 11th. Congress authorized the president to treat the resolution as specific statutory authorization under the War Powers Resolution, insulating the use of force from meaningful congressional restraint. Folks, that's not oversight. That's not restraint. That's a transfer of judgment. Congress did not decide whether war was necessary. It delegated that decision to the presidency, already captured by Cheney's theory of unchecked executive power and a legal apparatus designed by Addington to make that delegation permanent. This is the constitutional break. It did not arrive with tanks rolling into Baghdad. It arrived quietly in committee rooms, on floor votes, when Congress normalized the idea that it no longer needed to declare war to send the nation into one. From that moment forward, executive war-making stopped being an exception justified by emergency and became the norm justified by precedent. Cheney's parallel presidency, once controversial, became institutionalized. Addington's legal logic became portable. It survived changes in administration, party, and rhetoric. And this is the part that history often gets wrong. The Constitution did not fail because it was unclear. It failed because the people entrusted with enforcing it decided it was inconvenient. Words like inappropriate, anachronistic, and not how it's done anymore replaced constitutional duty. Congress did not argue that it lacked the authority to declare war. It argued that it no longer wished to exercise it. Once that line was crossed, it couldn't be uncrossed. Future presidents inherited the same discretion. Some used it cautiously, some abused it, but all benefited from the precedent. Wars no longer required consent. Deployments no longer required debate. Missions could expand, they could mutate, and they could persist without Congress ever reclaiming its role. Cheney did not just win the argument for Iraq, he rewrote the operating system. And before Iraq, undeclared wars were controversial. After Iraq, they were routine. And before Iraq, Congress still pretended it had a meaningful role, but after Iraq, it perfected the art of avoidance. Before Iraq, the Constitution constrained ambition. After Iraq, it was treated as optional. That is Dick Cheney's real legacy. Not one war, not one lie, but a system in which no war longer requires the consent of the governed. And once that system is in place, the question is no longer whether the next war will be justified. It's whether anyone will even be asked. By the time Congress voted, by the time Colin Powell ever stepped in front of the United Nations podium, the war was no longer a decision, it was an operation. Troops were already moving into position, naval assets were already staged, air corridors were already mapped, timelines were already set, the machinery of war, it doesn't wait for debate and it does not wait for votes that are designed to stop it. That is the final deception in the story. The Iraq AUMF did not authorize the war in any meaningful sense. It ratified a decision that had already been made inside the executive branch. What Congress provided was not restraint, it was insulation. This is what people mean when they say the vote was theater. The sets were built, the actors, they knew their lines, the ending was already locked in place. Contracts were already being discussed before the first bombs fell, reconstruction plans were already circulating, private companies were positioned to follow the military into Iraq the moment the invasion began. This was not contingency planning. This was a transfer of wealth to Dick Cheney's friends. It was an execution of a plan. Dick Cheney's machine understood something Congress either refused to acknowledge or chose not to confront. Once the operational gears start turning, stopping a war becomes politically impossible. And at that point, the vote is no longer about whether the war should happen. It's about whether Congress wants to be blamed for disrupting it. So they didn't. They fell in line. And once they did, the country followed. Because by the time the invasion began, Americans had been conditioned to accept it. The language was narrowed. The questions disappeared. War was treated as an event on the calendar, not a choice that required consent. The country believed, not because it had been persuaded by evidence, but because it had been overwhelmed by authority. Powell's credibility had done its work. Congress's abdication had done its work. Cheney's parallel presidency had done exactly what it was designed to do. There was no off-ramp. Once the bombs fell, debate became disrespect, doubt became disloyalty, accountability became hindsight. The war moved forward under its own momentum, insulated from democratic control. And here's the most corrosive truth of all. Once a war begins, the original lie no longer matters. What matters is sunk cost. Lives already lost, money already spent, political capital already invested. At that point, questioning the war feels cruel, even when it's necessary. That is how bad decisions get protected by good intentions. And that is why Iraq matters beyond Iraq, because the systems that made it possible did not collapse when the war failed. It survived, it adapted, it learned. Future administrations inherited the same tools: broad authorizations, executive discretion, congressional avoidance, media normalization. The same machinery that allowed one war to be launched without accountability made it easier for the next one to happen quietly. This is how undeclared war becomes normal. This is how National Guard units end up deployed into combat zones decades later without a declaration of war, without a clear mission, without an honest debate. This is how citizen soldiers pay the price for constitutional failure that Washington learned to live with. Which brings us back to where this episode began. The deaths of Iowa National Guard soldiers in Syria. It's not an accident. They're not a fluke. They're not disconnected from Iraq at all. They are the downstream consequence of a system that Dick Cheney helped build and Congress refused to dismantle. A system where war no longer requires consent, where authority no longer requires accountability, where the people are asked to absorb the cost without ever being asked the question. That system only survives if it goes unchallenged. And that's why this story about Dick Cheney, it matters now. If you support the work that we're doing with this podcast, and if you believe that Defend the Guard is an answer to curbing a runaway U.S. foreign policy and the overuse and misuse of the military and the National Guard on a world stage, I need you to go to defendtheguard.us and sign the petition. And if you're able, chip in a few bucks. Help us keep the work going at bringourtroopshome.us/donate. This fight doesn't move forward without people willing to stand up and back it. Because the Constitution didn't break itself. It was broken by people. And what was broken by people can be repaired by people who are willing to demand their authority back. National Guard soldiers are not tripwires. They are not leverage. They are not political cover. They are citizens first. We should remember that. Now, in the next episode, we are going to trace the real consequences of Dick Cheney's doctrine, from the collapse of the Middle East to the erosion of civil liberties at home, and how a single worldview reshaped the world that we're now living in. We'll see you then.